Snow moved across the land like a restless spirit, sweeping over the wooden bones of a small frontier chapel at the edge of town. The wind rattled its shutters and pushed through its cracked boards, carrying whispers of vows spoken too quickly and promises broken even faster. On the chapel steps, a young bride sat alone, her white gown stained with dust and melting flakes, her veil torn from the storm's grip. She was 22, her cheeks flushed from cold and shame, her bouquet scattered and trampled under boots that had carried her groom away. He had left her there before the altar's light had even dimmed. His words had cut sharper than winter's bite, hard words about her not being enough, about wasted time, about how he deserved better than someone as fragile as her. The townfolk, who had gathered in curiosity more than blessing, had not softened the blow. Some had muttered pity, others had smirked, and a few had whispered cruel satisfaction at seeing her dismissed like faulty trade goods. And so she sat, as daylight dwindled, discarded in the snow, her heart beating not with hope but with the weary rhythm of someone who felt her worth had been ground into the earth beneath her. Her breath quivered as she pulled the thin shawl tighter, yet it offered no warmth. With her lips pressed close to her hands, she whispered into the night, words not meant for anyone to hear. Just kill me fast. Not with bitterness, but with the resignation of a soul too tired to fight another day of ridicule. It was the kind of whisper a person made not to summon death, but because they were certain life had already closed its doors. The last of the wedding guests drifted away like shadows. A preacher's wife stepped forward, her eyes kind, her hands stretched out as though she could pull the young woman back into the circle of the living. But before she could speak comfort, the groom's kin drew her aside, hissing about shame and scandal, insisting the girl had brought it on herself. The woman's hand lingered in the air, then slowly fell, and the bride was left in the snow, small against the immensity of the white plains. From the edge of town, a figure watched. A man on horseback, tall in the saddle, his coat heavy with fur, his hat brim low against the snow. His eyes followed her with the patience of someone used to silence, a man who saw without intruding. When the last townsfolk had gone, he nudged his horse forward, hooves muffled by drifts. He stopped a few paces from her, climbed down, and unfastened the thick wool blanket strapped to his saddle. Without a word, he placed it around her shoulders. The warmth startled her as much as the gesture, but when she lifted her eyes, ready to refuse or to thank, he was already stepping back, mounting again, and turning his horse toward the dim line of hills. She held the blanket close that night, though she did not move from the steps. Pride or despair, she could not tell which, kept her rooted. As the hours lengthened, cold crept deeper. Snow stung her eyes, her limbs grew heavier, and at last, exhaustion pulled her down. She folded into the whiteness, whispering once more for death to come quickly. But when she opened her eyes again, she did not see the chapel or the cruel town. She saw firelight, golden and alive, dancing against rough-hewn timbers. She lay beneath the wool blanket, her gown dried beside the hearth. A kettle hissed softly, and the smell of strong coffee filled the air. Across the room, seated on a low stool, the man from the night before worked a piece of leather with steady hands. He did not speak, nor glance up as she stirred, but his presence carried a strange steadiness, like a mountain unmoved by storm. Her lips parted, uncertain whether to ask where she was, or why he had brought her. But the words caught. She had been thrown away once already, her voice stripped of worth. To speak now felt dangerous, as if it might fracture this fragile safety. So she said nothing, only gathered the blanket tighter, its coarse threads carrying the faint smell of horse, of smoke, of long miles traveled. He set down his work then, poured coffee into a tin cup, and placed it on the small table beside her. Still no words. Only the simple offering of warmth. She reached for it with trembling hands, the heat nearly burning after so much cold. She drank, and the bitter taste grounded her, reminded her that she was still here, still breathing. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls. Inside, time slowed. The silence was not empty. It held space, gave room for her shattered heart to begin stitching itself without pressure or demand. She studied him as he returned to his work, broad shoulders bent over leather, dark hair hidden under the shadow of his hat. There was nothing hurried about him, nothing sharp. His quiet was not like her groom's cold dismissal. It was something else. She set the cup down, her voice soft, the first words she had dared in hours. "I." He looked up at last, his eyes calm as a winter lake. He held her gaze for a moment, then returned it with only 3 words, steady and low. "Couldn't leave you." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. She lowered her eyes, the weight of her shame pressing heavy again. He didn't ask her name, nor her story. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she was grateful not to be questioned, not to be measured. The night deepened. She leaned into the blanket, her body sinking into warmth, exhaustion finally loosening its grip. Just before sleep claimed her, she wondered if perhaps her whispered plea had been answered after all, not with the death she had asked for, but with a chance she had not dared to imagine. And in that quiet cabin, with snow drifting beyond the window and a stranger sitting guard by the fire, the first fragile thread of her new story was drawn. A story not of endings, but of beginnings that asked for patience, for courage, for trust yet to be earned. It was not salvation, not yet. But it was the first night in a long while that she felt she might wake tomorrow and find herself still whole. And so she drifted into sleep, the blanket heavy around her, the fire humming its low lullaby, and the cowboy silent in his watch. Morning broke slowly over the hills, a pale light slipping through the frost-rimmed window of the cabin. The young woman stirred, her lashes heavy from sleep, her body reluctant to leave the warmth of the blanket. The fire had burned low, yet the room still carried a gentle heat, preserved by thick logs stacked neatly by the hearth. She could hear the sound of boots on wood outside, steady, purposeful, as though the world beyond her small cocoon was already awake and alive. She sat up, every movement cautious, her gown now folded carefully on a chair, mended at the seams where it had torn. A plain wool dress hung nearby, one she had not owned the night before. She reached for it, hesitating, her fingers brushing over fabric rougher than silk but stronger, warmer, more forgiving. When she slipped it over her shoulders, it was as though she stepped into another life, stripped of frills, closer to survival than ceremony. The door opened, and the cowboy entered with arms full of firewood. His coat and hat were dusted with snow, his cheeks touched with cold, but his expression unchanged, quiet, unreadable, steady. He stacked the logs by the hearth, shook the frost from his gloves, and moved about the room with the same deliberate calm as before. She watched him, expecting perhaps a word, a question, even a command. None came. Only the scrape of wood, the rustle of leather, the hiss of a log catching flame. On the small iron stove, a pot simmered, filling the air with the smell of beans and broth. He ladled a portion into a tin bowl and set it on the table between them. She hesitated, shame still clinging to her like a second skin. Yet hunger spoke louder, and she reached for the spoon, her hands trembling. He did not sit across from her, nor did he watch. Instead, he busied himself with mending tack, his presence large enough to be felt, yet never pressing in. The silence stretched, but it was not the suffocating kind she had known in the home of her groom's kin. That silence had been sharpened with judgment, filled with eyes that measured and mouths that whispered. This one was softer, as though it gave her permission to exist without explanation. For the first time in days, she ate without feeling observed, without fearing what the act of taking nourishment might mean. When the bowl was empty, she set it down carefully. The words in her chest pressed forward, asking to be spoken, yet her voice resisted, still too raw. He glanced at her then, not for long, but long enough that she felt the weight of being seen. It startled her, how steady his gaze was, how it carried no demand. She wanted to ask why he had brought her here, why he cared enough to carry her from the snow when the rest had turned away. But she held her tongue. The questions could wait. For now, survival was answer enough. Days folded into each other with a rhythm unlike any she had known. She helped where she could, fetching water from the stream, sweeping the small floor, mending seams on his shirts with needle and thread. At first, her hands shook, clumsy from neglect. But slowly they steadied, as though remembering a skill long left unused. In the evenings, he taught her the small routines of cabin life. How to bank the fire so it would burn through the night. How to check traps in the morning frost. How to recognize the signs of a storm on the horizon. He did not speak much, but when he did, his words carried weight. Short phrases, simple truths. Don't ride against the wind. Keep your boots dry. Always face the fire when you're warming your hands. His voice was low, textured by years of silence, but there was something grounding in it, something that reached deeper than words alone. As snow fell thick and heavy outside, she found herself tracing the lines of the blanket he had given her, the one that had saved her life. She turned toward him, her voice breaking the quiet for the first time in days. "You should have left me." He looked up from his work, the knife in his hand pausing mid-whittle. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not confusion, nor pity, but something steadier. "Didn't seem right," he answered. She wanted to argue, to tell him she was not worth the trouble, that he had only taken in another burden. But the words dissolved. His answer had been plain, unpolished, yet it left no room for doubt. To him, it was as simple as fire to wood, necessary, unquestioned. The more she tried to hide her story, the more fragments slipped free. A broken vow here, a bitter word there, the cruel laughter of townsfolk echoing in her memory. One night, as the fire burned low, she let the truth spill like water through cracks. How her groom had left her on the chapel steps, how the whispers of neighbors had cut deeper than knives, how she had wished for death because life seemed nothing but a long road of shame. He said nothing at first, his knife moving over wood in slow stroke. She feared he would dismiss her pain as others had. But when he finally spoke, it was not to judge nor to pry. His words were few. "You deserved better." She stared at him, startled by their simplicity. Better was a word she had not allowed herself to imagine. Yet the way he said it, steady and certain, made it feel less like wishful thinking and more like truth. The days grew less heavy. He showed her how to ride his spare horse, a gray with gentle eyes. At first she resisted, her skirts clumsy, her fear sharp. But he was patient, leading the reins, guiding her with a calm that quieted her trembling. When she finally sat steady, the horse carrying her across the snow without falter, a laugh escaped her lips, small, sudden, unguarded. The sound startled her as much as it startled him. For a moment he paused, watching her, and she saw the faintest ghost of a smile tug at his mouth before he turned back to the trail. Yet beyond the walls of the cabin, the world had not forgotten. The town carried its gossip like dry grass waiting for spark. Men at the saloon whispered that she had run off in shame, that she had thrown herself into the arms of another before her vows were finished. Her groom, bitter with wounded pride, spread poison in every ear that would listen. She was called ruined, cursed, a burden no man should claim. The words reached her eventually, carried by the lips of a peddler passing through. They struck her like stones, but this time she did not crumble. She held the reins of the gray horse tighter, her spine straighter, as though the land itself lent her strength. That night, as she sat by the fire, she thought of those whispers. They no longer defined her, though they still stung. Instead, she found herself weighing the silence of the cabin against the noise of the town. Here, she was not judged, not measured. She was simply herself, a woman learning to rise again. She glanced across the flames at the cowboy, his figure steady in the glow, and for the first time she wondered if perhaps her story was not ending, but only beginning. Sleep came easier now. She drifted into dreams where her hands were strong, her voice unshaken, her worth unquestioned. And in those dreams, always, the steady sound of boots on wood lingered close, like a promise that the loneliness she had once carried need not follow her into every tomorrow. Still, the world outside had teeth, and its bite was drawing nearer. She felt it in the weight of whispers, in the shadow of threats unspoken. Yet she also felt something new rising within her, a spark she had thought forever lost. And as the snow thickened against the cabin walls, she knew the storm ahead would not be one she faced alone. The winter deepened, and with it the rhythm of the cabin grew into something almost like a life shared. Morning brought the crunch of snow under boots, the smoke of the chimney curling into gray sky, the sound of two voices, one hesitant, the other low, learning to exist side by side. The young woman found herself waiting for the sound of his steps, the scrape of his knife against wood, the calm presence that filled the silence between them. What had once been unbearable quiet now became a space where she could breathe. Her days were no longer marked by shame but by small victories. She learned to carry water without spilling it, to mend seams tight enough that the wind could not creep through. He showed her how to split wood, though the axe felt strange and heavy in her hands. When her strength faltered, his hand closed over hers, steadying the handle, guiding her swing until the log cracked clean. She laughed then, a sudden burst she could not hold back, and though he said nothing, his eyes softened. The blanket he had first placed around her shoulders remained draped across her bed. Each night she pulled it close, remembering that first gesture, silent, unassuming, and yet more merciful than any word. It reminded her she had not been abandoned to the snow, that someone had chosen to act when the rest had turned away. But peace, like winter's ice, was fragile. Whispers from town began to seep into the hills. A passing traveler, warming himself by their fire, carried stories with him. Folks saying she had run off, that she had betrayed her vows before the ink of marriage had even dried. Men muttered that she had bewitched the cowboy, trapping him with her disgrace. And louder than all were the bitter words of the man who had once stood with her at the altar, spitting venom to anyone who would listen, painting himself the victim and her the curse. The words stung, though she tried to brush them aside. One evening, she stood by the door, looking out across the snowbound fields, her breath fogging the glass. "They'll never stop," she whispered, not to him, but to the cold. He rose from his chair, moving to stand beside her. For a long moment he said nothing, only letting the silence hold her. Then, in that quiet, his voice came, low and certain. "Let them talk. They can't touch what they don't own." The words lingered. She turned them over in her heart, feeling something inside her shift. She was not property, though men had treated her as such. She was not ruined, though the town declared it. The truth of his voice cut deeper than the lies of gossip. As the days passed, trust bloomed in ways she did not expect. She found herself speaking more freely, her past spilling not as confession but as release. She told him of her childhood, of the hollow hunger of wanting to be chosen, of the moment at the chapel when she realized she was not wanted, not by him, not by anyone. He listened, never once interrupting. At last, when her words faltered, he said softly, "You wanted life, even when you asked for death. That's why you're here." It was not a declaration, not even comfort, but a truth spoken plain. And hearing it, she felt for the first time that perhaps she had chosen life, though she had not known it at the time. One afternoon, as the snow eased and the sky cleared, he saddled the gray horse for her again. "Ride," he said simply, handing her the reins. She mounted, her skirts tucked, her grip unsteady. He walked beside her at first, his hand near the bridle. When she looked down at him, she caught something unspoken in his eyes, pride, quiet and patient. When at last she urged the horse into a slow trot, her heart lifted, and she realized she was not merely surviving. She was learning to live again. But the shadow of conflict grew darker. The preacher's son arrived at the cabin one evening, his coat dusted with snow, his voice sharp with self-righteousness. He spoke not to her, but past her, as though she were invisible. "She belongs to her husband's kin," he said coldly. "The whole town knows she's been taken. Folks won't stand for it." The cowboy did not rise from his chair. He only leaned back, his eyes steady on the younger man. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. The preacher's son bristled, his hand twitching toward the pistol at his hip, but after a tense moment he turned and left, muttering threats into the snow. When the door closed, she stood frozen, her pulse quick. He looked at her then, not with fear, but with a question. "Do you want to go back?" The words struck her harder than the preacher's son had. He was not claiming her, not holding her. He was giving her the choice. No one had ever done that. She felt her throat tighten, her voice breaking when she finally spoke. "If I go back, they'll kill me," slow with their words. "If I stay," she paused, her eyes meeting his. "If I stay, maybe I'll find who I am." He nodded once, as though her words were enough, as though no oath or vow was required beyond that. The fire crackled between them, and for the first time in her life she felt not like a burden or a possession, but like a person who mattered. That night, lying beneath the blanket, she did not whisper for death. She whispered something else, though too soft for him to hear. A prayer, perhaps, or a promise to herself, that she would no longer measure her worth by the cruelty of others, that she would stand, even if standing cost her everything. The snow outside deepened, the air sharpening with the scent of storm. Change was coming, she could feel it in her bones, in the way the world seemed to hold its breath. And as she closed her eyes, she knew the choice she had made would be tested. The storm would not pass them by. It was riding closer with every whisper from town, with every bitter word fanned into flame. Still, she did not fear as she once had. For now, when she thought of tomorrow, she thought not of ending but of endurance, of the steady figure who had placed a blanket on her shoulders and asked for nothing in return. Whatever storm was coming, she would not face it alone. The storm broke not with snow, but with men. Dawn rose gray and bitter, and with it came the distant thunder of hooves rolling across the valley. She woke to the sound, her breath quick in the stillness of the cabin, her hand clutching the blanket as though its weight alone might shield her. Outside, voices carried on the wind, sharp, accusing, angry. They were not whispers now. They had come with force, with intent. The cowboy was already on his feet, pulling his coat from its peg, his movements calm, almost practiced. He checked the iron latch on the door, then crossed to the window, where shadows moved against the snow. A dozen men, maybe more, their lanterns bobbing like restless stars, their faces hardened by cold and purpose. At their front, the preacher's son and the kin of the man who had left her at the chapel. Their voices cut through the morning stillness, demanding, condemning. Her body trembled as she rose, pressing close to the fire's warmth. "They've come for me," she whispered, her voice nearly breaking. He looked back at her then, his eyes steady, unwavering. "They can only take you if you let them." The words struck her deeper than any sermon. For a moment, fear battled with the fragile strength she had found in the quiet of these walls. She remembered the chapel, the laughter, the snow biting her skin as she whispered for death. She remembered how he had seen her when no one else had, not as ruined, not as worthless, but as living. That memory steadied her, like a hand at her back. The pounding on the door rattled the frame. "Send her out," a voice barked. "She belongs to us." Another voice, venomous, followed. "You'll pay for stealing what ain't yours." The cowboy stepped to the door, his hand brushing the pistol at his side, though he did not draw it. When he spoke, his voice was low, firm, carrying through the wood like the rumble of distant thunder. "She's not yours to claim." Murmurs rose outside, sharp as wind through brittle trees. Boots crunched closer. A fist slammed again. But before he could speak further, she stepped forward, her fingers brushing the edge of his coat. Her voice trembled, but her gaze was fierce. "Let me answer them." He studied her, his jaw tight, then gave a single nod. She drew in a breath, pulled the latch, and opened the door to the frozen morning. The crowd recoiled slightly at the sight of her, not fragile in silk but standing in rough wool, her hair loose, her face pale but unbroken. The cold bit her skin, but she did not flinch. "You left me to die," she said, her voice carrying over the snow. Her eyes locked on the man who had once called himself her groom, his lips curling into a cruel smirk. You called me nothing, and now you dare claim me as though I am property to be fetched back. Her voice rose, firmer, stronger. I would sooner freeze in these hills than crawl behind you again. The preacher's son spat into the snow. You shame this town. A woman cast aside has no place but to return where she belongs. Her chest burned, but she did not falter. I don't belong to you. I don't belong to him. I belong to myself. And I choose to stay. The words hung in the air, heavier than any bullet. The men shifted, their certainty shaken. The groom's kin cursed, their hands twitching near their weapons, but it was not her defiance alone that unsettled them. It was the man who stepped into the doorway behind her, tall and unyielding, his shadow stretching long over the snow. He rested one hand on the frame, the other near his holster, though he did not draw. His silence was its own kind of warning, his presence more dangerous than a dozen shouted threats. The preacher's son sneered. You'd defy us all for him? For a stranger? Her throat tightened, but her voice rang clear. Not for him. For me. Because I have finally been given a choice. A murmur rippled through the crowd, doubt spreading like cracks in ice. Some shifted uneasily, others lowered their eyes. Only a few still bristled, clinging to pride and anger. The man who had left her snarled, stepping forward, his hand on his pistol. Then you'll die with him. The world stilled. The cowboy's hand moved, slow and sure, his body angled between her and the threat. Snowflakes drifted in the silence, each one sharp as glass. For a moment it seemed violence would erupt, that the valley would echo with gunfire. But then her voice rang out again, fierce as fire. I am not afraid of death. I was afraid of living, once. Not any more. Her words cut deeper than steel. The groom faltered, his sneer cracking into something less certain. The crowd shifted again, no longer bound together by one cause. Some muttered, some turned their horses, unwilling to draw blood over a woman's defiance. The preacher's son tried to rally them, but the fire had already broken. One by one, the riders peeled away, their anger dissolving into the snow. At last only the groom remained, his face twisted with rage, but even he knew when a battle was lost. With a final curse, he spat at the ground, turned his horse, and disappeared into the trees. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the wind. She stood trembling, her breath clouding in the cold, her heart pounding not with fear, but with something fiercer. The cowboy closed the door behind them, the sound of the latch firm, final. For a long moment neither spoke. Then he turned to her, his eyes softer now, though his voice remained steady. You stood. She drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her chest rising and falling. Because you gave me the space to. The fire had burned low, but its warmth still reached them. She sank onto the chair, exhaustion flooding her, yet it was not the exhaustion of despair. It was the heaviness that came after battle, after survival. He crouched beside her, his presence steady, and for the first time she leaned into him, not as someone rescued, but as someone who had chosen. The storm had passed, though its memory lingered. She knew the town would still whisper, still judge. But whispers could not undo what had been claimed in the open snow. She was no longer the bride left on the chapel steps, whispering for death. She was a woman who had spoken her own truth, who had faced the mob and not broken. The cowboy placed the blanket more firmly around her shoulders, his touch careful, reverent. She met his gaze, and in it she saw not salvation, but companionship. A man who had chosen to stand beside her, not above her. Outside, the valley stretched quiet under the weight of winter, but in the cabin, the air was different, lighter, warmer. A new chapter had begun, though its words were not yet written. And as the fire crackled, the storyteller's voice lingered like an echo over the snow. In a land where worth was too often measured in cattle and coin, two souls had discovered a rarer treasure. Not possession, not rescue, but the quiet, unyielding truth of choosing, and being chosen in return.